intelligencesquared.com.
Simon gave us a fascinating and informative talk. And the reason I didn't ask any questions was that the only thing he omitted to do was to argue that London's policy on climate change should begin in Beijing. In fact, he gave us a very persuasive account of why London's policy on climate change should not begin in Beijing. He showed us that an awful lot is happening over there and very little is happening over here. He showed us too that it would be completely inappropriate for us to try to govern or manage or even heavily influence policy in Beijing, not that we could if we wanted to. He showed us that we are the laggards and they are the people who are making the running. So what's the obvious conclusion from that? The obvious conclusion, as I'm sure Simon is painfully aware, is that London's policy on climate change should begin in London. Now, as I get longer in the tooth, I notice something about the human psyche, that a forceful influence within it is projection. That those faults that we are most prone to see in others are often the faults that we're least inclined to see in ourselves. And one of those, it strikes me with particular force, is the issue of responsibility. Because many of the people who tell us most volubly that we should take responsibility for ourselves are those who seem least inclined to take responsibility for themselves. So, for instance, they're the people who deregulated the banks and then blamed everybody else when the chickens came home to roost. They're the people who say that the poor should carry the costs of those decisions, while their own economic class escapes without any responsibility for it at all. And there are people like George Osborne, not to mention any names, who at the Conservative Party conference gave the impression that because China's emissions are rising so much, there's absolutely no point in doing anything about our own, thereby absolving responsibility for our emissions. Now, it is true that at 2% of global emissions, it's not a huge amount of the total global pool. But of course, in terms of actual responsibility, per capita responsibility, that's far more than our fair share. China's emissions currently run from fossil fuels alone, this is, at 5.3 tons per person per year, ours at 8.5. So for us to turn to China and say, you people should be clearing up your act, while we are doing so little that our emissions are actually rising, well, it's a bit like the Daily Mail's policy on nudity. On the left-hand side of its website, the left-hand column, it fulminates bitterly against the smut on TV, and the right-hand side of the column is entirely composed of young women bursting out of their bikinis. And that kind of is where we are when it comes to Britain lecturing China about where things should be going. And of course, it's true that China's emissions are rising fast. And as Simon says, they're rising fast partly because our emissions are falling. We have found it very convenient for all sorts of reasons to outsource our manufacturing. And in so doing, we've outsourced our manufacturing emissions. And this way, it's just wonderful. We get to have our cake and eat it. We can say, look, we're sticking within our Kyoto targets because our emissions have fallen 29% since 1990. So aren't we fantastic? Look at Canada, there's a risen 26%. They're the bad guys, we're the good guys. But as soon as you take those outsourced emissions into account, the emissions which, as Simon says, we are ultimately responsible for by consuming the goods that are being produced in countries like China, then that more than cancels out. It's 32% of what was there in 1990. It more than cancels out the 29% that we have saved. And so we find ourselves in this position of an absolute abnegation of responsibility by being able, because of this artifact of the international accounting system for emissions, to wash our hands of this problem because somebody else is doing it for us. And so, in a way, you could turn this round and say that Beijing's policy on climate change should begin in London because the thing which is going to affect China's emissions, its growing emissions most, is going to be a reduction in the consumption of manufactured goods in countries like the UK and the rest of the developing world. But let's put aside everything we know about the current state of the world and say we were in a position to try to persuade China to cut its emissions, talking to the motion here, and say that London's policy on climate change should begin in Beijing. We should be telling the Chinese what they should be doing because it's easier and quicker to make big cuts there and because their emissions are rising so fast. How would we go about it? Gunboat diplomacy was quite effective during the Opium Wars, getting China to do what we wanted, but diplomatic sources tell me it is likely to be less efficacious today. And I would have some concern about the extra carbon emissions caused by the onset of a Third World War. We could try outsourcing our cuts just as we have outsourced our emissions. In other words, through the time-honoured process of the sale of absolutions, otherwise known as offsetting, where we pay another country to cut our emissions on our behalf because we don't want to do it because it's too expensive at home. And sure, the economic case looks fairly straightforward. You can make bigger cuts in China for a certain amount of money than you could make in Britain for the same amount of money. Straightforward. Well, that's fine if the only cuts you're trying to make are 5 or 10% of your total emissions. Then it's quite easy to offset. But as soon as you start climbing into the teens and then the tens of percent of your emissions, you run into a few barriers, not least is a barrier of mathematics. I worked out, for instance, that if the developed world tried to cut 50% of its emissions through offsetting, it would require a cut of 125% in the developing world in order to do the offsetting. Now, you might have noticed a slight problem with that as a strategy. In fact, if we were to go the whole hog and say, you know, our policies should begin in Beijing or begin in Mumbai or begin in any other part of the developing world, and we were going to try to make the entire 80 or 90% cut, which we would need to do to stay within 2 degrees, we would need to offset our emissions not just to the developing world of planet Earth, but also to the developing worlds of Mars and Jupiter. That's the only way in which we could make sense of that policy. So what do we have left? The only thing we have left, if we were to assume that we have any influence over Beijing whatsoever, would be persuasion. And there are 2 kinds of persuasion. There's hypocritical persuasion, of the kind that this government's quite good at practicing, that responsibility thing again, which is to say, do as we say, but not as we do. And there is persuasive persuasion, to say, we are doing it, you can do it too. Of course, it's kind of working the other way round, as Simon has established. But you know, what has completely scuppered the climate talks, both at Copenhagen and at Cancun, has been this perfect circle of finger-pointing where everybody is trying to unload the responsibility onto everybody else by saying, you're the ones who's got to make the cuts, we're not going to do it. And this carbon nationalism, which has completely jiggered any attempts to have a replacement for Kyoto, let alone an agreement which brings in all the nations of the world. And it's not until somebody breaks that perfect circle of finger-pointing by saying, okay, we accept the pressing need for overall cuts, not just carbon intensity cuts, which is what ultimately we're seeing in China, overall cuts in our greenhouse gas emissions, and we are going to demonstrate our acceptance of that by making major real cuts of our own, not offshored cuts of our own, real cuts of our own. That's the only thing which is going to break that logjam at the international climate talks and encourage other countries to do the same. And so what we're talking about here is leadership and responsibility, 2 things which are manifestly lacking when it comes to climate change policy in the UK or indeed in most of the developing world. And what that requires, ladies and gentlemen, is that London's policy on climate change begins and ends in London. Thank you very much. I forgot I had to be grilled.
Thank you very much, Georgia. We appreciate it. Simon and Vicky, would you like to ask any questions or make any statements?
Are we allowed to pass as well?
Oh, sure you are.
Thank you. I'll pass.
One of those Malcolm questions. Malcolm
question wasn't actually a question, as you established.
Of course.
I wouldn't mind a Malcolm question at all.
So a comment and a sort of comment, sort of a question. I think the comment is perhaps kind of passing the title or the motion. It seems to me quite clear that our climate impacts will be principally determined in countries like China, not by our policies here. And the examples I've given are intended to establish that. What that means is not that we should go persuading China to do something different from what it's doing. Actually, my own view, despite Malcolm's comments, is that China is making remarkable moves with risks, I agree, but that we need to understand that the way in which to leverage the green growth strategy which is emerging with power from China is not for us to have a climate policy here, but to have an economic policy here that makes sense. And I think my question to you, and it may be simply an area, George, that we agree on, is it not more important that this country works out how it's going to develop its next generation of industries, how it's going to reform the financial markets, how it's going to prevent itself being party to US protectionism, and how it's going to invest in public infrastructure for the next generation of economy to come, none of which are climate policy, but all of which are economic policy. Because if we don't do that, then frankly we will resist the advantage that China brings to us because of a fear for our livelihoods. So I think the question is, surely what you and I and we should be arguing is not that climate policy should be made here, but that economic policy should be made here.
Well, I
Thank you,
wouldn't.
Simon. Actually, that's taken the 2 minutes. It was a great question, but it's taken the 2 minutes. So actually,
Can I just very
I'll ask you to come back to it, actually, in the course of our discussion, because that is the crux.